Before we open up for the Q&A round, I would like to invite Jamie Leather, who's the head of the ADB's Transport Sector Group, who will give a brief commentary on your presentation. And can I ask participants to please raise their hands using the button at the bottom of the screen to flag that they want to ask a question. So go ahead, Jamie. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor. Very interesting presentation. I think the title, there's one very simple answer. I think transport is at a crossroads now in terms of what future and technology, large data sources, and obviously the research you've done here can open up all sorts of insights into people's trip patterns and how to better serve those through MaaS or other TNC services. Just putting a little bit of an Asia Pacific developing member country spin on this. Many of the transport trips within our cities are public transport trips. It's around 70 to 80%. Unlike North America or Europe, these are captive trips in that the users or the population do not have access to motorcycles or cars. So what we're looking at is in terms of how we can, rather than shift people out of their private vehicles, we need to maintain them within their current mode of transport, which tends to be the public transport side. And I think the lessons you showed would be very effective. Taking the broadest possible definition of mobility as a service, not just the TNC, but looking at this in terms of public transport and multi-leg trips, be that tuk-tuks, tricycles, rickshaws, all of those through to the metro systems at one end. I think this kind of information and planning is very important. My final point really is looking at the service type of transport or transit within the Asia Pacific urban areas. You mentioned the very high price that was paid for a New York City taxi medallion. To some extent, the public transport systems in many Asian cities are somewhat similar, in that a franchise to operate a bus or a jeepney or a tricycle or whatever it may be has quite a value. And this is a result of perhaps not fully controlling the system, or the system is allowed to operate more in a laissez-faire type of approach. Exactly. The data you were talking about will allow a very different level of oversight and matching supply to demand. And I think that, above all else in this region, would be a fascinating role of the large data and looking at mobility as a service. Unfortunately, many of our government counterparts are pretty much blind because they don't have any data. They're not really sure who's traveling where or how often or at what times of the day, only to have the sorts of data you showed for New York City on hour by hour. It is there. We can access Waze data, we can access the Uber data, we can access those components. But at the moment, very few governments or city authorities are. And I think in terms of your title for the presentation, this technology, this access to data to make better informed decisions and improve the service that allows people to be mobile around a city, that is what's key, and that's what we really see as exciting and maybe a game changer in the next decade or the next few years. So thank you very much for the presentation. I was not so much referring to the TNC side of it, but more the broader definition of mobility and all those very important lessons you highlighted, and the use of data and technology could be spread out across the entire transit system, even traffic signals as well. So we may include some of the private mode vehicle restraint measures too. Thank you very much. That's all. And sorry, two final points on COVID. We're just about to release a guidance note on the impacts of transport from COVID-19 across the Asia Pacific region. So again, similar lessons to those you saw, huge drop-off, a return, but a reluctance of people to use public transport systems, which will make many of the very dense cities in Asia struggle if we cannot reinvigorate the mass transit systems. Definitely. Thank you very much for your presentation. Sure. And a few words on the Asian context within there as well. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jamie. If I could ask Satish just to make an overall response at the end. Let's just field a couple of questions now because we have a few hands raised. So firstly, Dean Sonobe, please go ahead with your question.
Thank you very much, Professor, for the very nice presentation of very interesting research. My question is about how to increase good use or better use of this mobility as service technologies. So for this purpose, what kind of infrastructure investment would be useful? Useful from the perspective of sustainability, reduced emission of carbon emission, NOx emission, those things, as well as fuel efficiency and those things. And then also, what kind of human resource, human capital investment will be useful?
I think very good questions. I think, so the first one, I mean, we are still, as Jamie mentioned, this is a really exciting time to be a transportation researcher because we are in the midst of seeing a lot of these transformations happening. And I think we have kind of, we have been in the era where there's no smartphone. The first iPhone came in 2007. We are seeing all these changes happening. So we are still in the midst of all of these changes. And so I think cities are kind of in a reactionary mode right now. I mean, they're just reacting to a lot of things that are actually happening. But for them to be able to be more proactive in terms of how to do these things, we need to have some of these insights shared with governments so that they can see this comprehensive impacts of the shared mobility or mobility as a service, right? Because last 10 years, right, Uber, I think, started around 2011, 12 time period. They have been completely unregulated. I mean, there's no regulation. I mean, these technologies have been thrown at cities. Like even if you see like this bike sharing, like Bird and all of this Lime and so on, I mean, they're just thrown at cities and now there are accidents and people are getting into a lot of issues and cities don't know how to kind of handle this, right? So the cities are kind of at the back foot right now. And so I think the lessons that we actually can learn is, one, we need to, when we have these MaaS technologies or FHVs or e-mobility option, we need to carefully look at the comprehensive impacts of this. And so when we do financing or when we allow these things to enter our city, we need to be kind of, we need to put the societal good as one important attribute of allowing them to operate within the city, right? So we cannot just make it completely unregulated like what it is right now. So I think there are many ways to do that. So one is we need to have this holistic impacts of these assessments, and then we need to kind of compute what those social costs are, just like what we did in our emissions, energy, and so on. And then we can kind of do financing based upon that. On the human costs, I think there is no silver bullet, right? And because every city and every country has different policies at the national and state level. So this has to be done under the framework of the federal government and then the local city governments, right? Because these medallions itself do operate differently. Like if you see Tokyo, completely different kind of a licensing market as compared to New York. Beijing, very different again. So I think we need to really look at solutions which are fair, both for these emerging technologies, but also kind of make sense for people who are already operating in the current framework. So how do we really come up with these fairness metrics? And the first place to start is quantification of these human impacts. And only then, once we know what the effects are, then we can develop some regulatory policies to kind of reduce these human impacts that are there.
Okay, thank you for these responses. I have 3 further questions from the audience, which we can maybe take together. And I would ask you, if possible, to be brief with the questions. So firstly, Linda, secondly, Peter Morgan, and thirdly, Dina. So Linda, go ahead with your question, please.
Many thanks for your presentation again. I'm just wondering how the rise in these technologies has affected mass transit ridership. Are there, and if it's, I would assume that it has negatively affected the numbers in mass transit. Are there any risks for government financing then of public transit if ridership is down? Because you know, it's I suppose disproportionately the poor that access public transit, and what may be the implications of that in the future.
Thank you, Linda. Sorry, Sadish, but let's take the questions all together. I think it's better. So Peter, can you ask your question now, please?
Yes, yeah, thanks very much for a very interesting presentation. This is going in a slightly different direction, but you touched on the issues of congestion and pollution. I wonder, is anybody looking at how to use this data real time, say, to control traffic lights, to control traffic? Thanks.
And finally, Dina, please go ahead.
Yeah, thank you. My question about like Grabs and Uber, they replace mostly taxi, or they also replace public transport? Because if they replace private cars or taxi, then it's good for environment. But if they replace public transport, then it's probably will be negative effect on environment.
Okay, thank you very much. Sadish, if you can attempt to answer those three questions together, that would be excellent.
Yeah, okay. The first one from Linda is about the impacts on the transit ridership. So there is very clear evidence that currently these FHVs and various kinds of MaaS technologies are directly competing with the transit ridership, particularly in dense urban areas like New York City and so on, right? So in the place I come from, West Lafayette, a small town, not so much, but in dense urban areas, there's directly competing with the transportation system. So we see, like, for example, in New York City, I did not show it here, but about a drop of 10 to 12% in terms of the subway ridership or after Uber has entered this market, right? So the simple answer is yes, there is competition between this FHV and this transit ridership that is there, right? So the solution that we actually have been arguing for is that they should be complementary. So because that would actually kind of help us to have a more sustainable form of transportation where transit is actually being complemented in terms of first and last mile connectivity, for example, with the Uber and Lyft kind of trips, right? So, but Uber, of course, for business reasons, I mean, that would not be a good model for them. So what we're trying to do is, especially we're working on a project right now, where we are kind of trying to provide Uber as an alternate form of transportation to increase accessibility for opportunities for these low-income neighborhoods, like in Bronx and Queens, using Uber as a shuttle service, which we used to have many years back, so that it connects to them to opportunities, be it work or be it job-related opportunities and so on. The second idea for these kind of low-income neighborhoods is also to provide better access to bus stops and transit stops, and so provide better connectivity to the public transportation, so that there is not a lot of competition, but there is a lot of complementarity between these modes of transportation, right? So that's something which is very, very important. I think Peter's question about can this data be used in real time? That's a very interesting question. Actually, Didi, the company in China, we have discussed opportunities related to that. So using basically how can we use this real-time location data to infer the queue length that is there at this traffic light based upon Didi data, and then optimize the traffic light based upon this information. And so there's some algorithms that you actually can develop to estimate the skew length and optimize the signal timings, right? So we have kind of had discussions with them, but the thing is, there are other ways of doing the same thing. Like you can use Bluetooth technology. I mean, we have done that using other kinds of technology, like for example, LPR, license plate recognition data from cameras in China and other cities. So there are other ways in which you can detect this, because what you need for optimizing signal timings very accurately is you need this queue length information. You need to know how many people are there in the through lane, right lane, and left lane. And so then you can kind of take that as an input in your control algorithm and optimize it based upon that. So, so there are alternate ways of doing that. So Didi started this program actually 5 years back, and recently they have kind of wound that down because they're not seeing a lot of business. There's not a good business model when you actually want to do that. But that's still a very viable idea. If city governments wants to use that as a supplementary data source, I think that's fantastic. We can certainly do that. The last question from Dina is, I'm trying to process the question, if correct me if I'm correct. So are you asking if these Uber type of trips replace public transportation, or are they, is it similar to the first question? Is it competing or is it complementary? Is that the question?
Yeah, I think Uber does both, right? Replacing both private cars and public transportation. So maybe it's to great extent replacing private cars. So then overall impact is positive on the environment. Yes, I mean, actually Uber does multiple things. Like for example, the reason you see 70% of the trips within Manhattan, I mean, Manhattan is big, but it's actually not that, it is pretty well connected by subway, and it's also pretty walkable, right? What you see is it not only replaces the traditional taxi trips, and it replaces some of the transit trips, but it also replaces walking trips. People who would have walked those 10 or 12 blocks to go to that next meeting, or to take a, to go somewhere for a restaurant for lunch, they're now taking Uber because it's actually much more convenient. So it's actually replacing a lot of other active forms of transportation. And that's actually one, I think, certainly one concern that is actually there. So because it's kind of, we certainly need this alternate, more active forms of transportation, both biking as well as walking trips, especially in the urban core. And we see that Uber is actually kind of replacing some of those trips.
Okay, thank you very much for your excellent answers as usual, and an excellent second presentation. We've come to the end. It's now 10 o'clock, so I would like to ask Dean Sanoa for some concluding remarks. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. Oh, I wanted to ask another question.
Please do, please.
About your proposal for the collaboration with ADBI and ADB. So I found the word insurance option for mobility service. So insurance for what kind of risk?
Insurance for, so for example, I mean, there are different, one is insurance in terms of the personal insurance. Like for example, right now insurance is based upon group risk. Right? It's based upon the group risk of a particular pool type that you belong to, either based upon your age distribution or the area that you live in and so on. But how can you do usage-based insurance? Since now you have more finer information about where you start, where you go, which route you take, what car you would drive, and so on. How can we, and your driving information and so on. So how can you do more personalized user-based insurance of these vehicles? Now think of autonomous vehicles. Now if you have this autonomy in the mix, it becomes much more different. That's one kind of insurance I was talking about. The second is the risk related to financing these projects, right? When you do financing of these type of technology projects, smart mobility kind of projects, how do you really assess the risk that is there? Not just the benefits, but also the risk that is there in terms of investing in these projects. Because when people don't see that this is good for the environment, are people still going to use these technologies? When people see that there is a lot of environmental and energy related impacts, the people are maybe not going to use these technologies as much. One, because it's not just good for the cities. And two, because the societal value of these kind of technologies has decreased. So how do you consider that into the risk and then consider financing options as part of that? So these are the two kinds of things we are kind of thinking about.
Okay, thank you once again for the wonderful presentation and very nice answer to all the questions, including mine. And then this further warrant further discussion with you. Okay, thank you very much.
Absolutely, absolutely.
Come back again.
Yes, I will. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you very much, everyone, for the for the rest of the day. Goodbye.
Yeah, have a good day, everyone. Bye-bye.
Thank you very much, Professor Kari.
Bye-bye.